They set fire to everything they had, just to pry open the gates of that death factory. These 1,000 Jewish prisoners set fire to their own camp to pry open the factory gates. On August 2nd, 1943, a railway worker saw a smoke column rise beyond the trees near Treblinka. He stopped his work. He lifted his camera. He framed the smoke and pressed the shutter. The photograph did not show people. It did not need to. It fixed one fact in the open air. The camp was burning that day. That smoke mattered because Treblinka was not a prison meant to hold people. It was built to kill and to leave as few witnesses as possible. It was one of the extermination centers tied to Operation Reinhard. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum estimates that about 925,000 Jews were murdered there. Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center, gives an estimate closer to about 870,000. The numbers differ, but the scale does not. A place built to kill on that scale could also be built to erase itself when the time came. By the summer of 1943, the forced laborers inside Treblinka had a fear that did not depend on rumor. They were not only watching transports arrive and people disappear, they were watching the camp move toward an ending. Later records describe German efforts to destroy evidence at extermination sites. Men inside Treblinka could read that intent through daily changes. Work details began to shift. Tasks began to look less like keeping a system running and more like making a system vanish. That change tightened the calendar around them. If the camp shut down, the labor group would not be released. The labor group would be removed. One man worked close to doors and hardware. His tasks brought him near locks, hinges, and barred routes. He did not write anything down in a safe place. He could not. He carried the map in his head and in his hands. When he saw a key ring on a belt, he noted where it went. When he saw a door open and close under guard, he noted what it blocked. He did not need a complete blueprint. He needed one seam that could be pried open for minutes. Another man worked where tools were stored and issued. He handled picks and axes as part of daily labor. Guards saw only work. He saw weight, edge, and reach. He also saw access. A tool behind a locked door was not a weapon. A tool left where a man could grab it in one motion could become a weapon for seconds. Seconds were the only currency the prisoners expected to afford. The organizers did not have the option of an open meeting. They built a plan through fragments. They spoke in pairs. They moved information in short bursts. They watched who could hold silence and who could not. They did not recruit for pride. They recruited for reliability. A man who wanted to talk was a risk. A man who could listen and act was an asset. They cut the goal down until it could fit inside the time they thought they might steal. They did not plan to hold the camp. They did not plan to defeat the guards. They chose two outcomes they could still achieve even if the camp crushed them. They would tear open a way out for some men. They would set a fire that would be seen outside the fences. Fire served both goals. It could damage structures and supplies. It could also send smoke above the trees. Smoke could reach people who were not part of the camp. Smoke could travel without a messenger. Smoke could survive even if the men who lit it did not. Choosing fire created a new problem. A fire that starts too early warns the guards. A fire that starts too late traps runners inside heat and gunfire. The plan needed timing as much as it needed courage. The organizers treated time like equipment. They tried to place it where they could reach it. They divided the laborers into small groups with small tasks. One group would focus on getting access to stored weapons, even if the weapons were few. One group would seize tools and move them to hands that could use them. One group would start the fire. One group would move toward the escape route the moment the signal came. Each group knew only what it had to do. That kept the plan alive. It also meant many men would act with partial understanding, and partial understanding could turn into chaos. Later, records indicate the prisoners managed to take a small number of firearms from the camp armory. The plan could not depend on that happening cleanly. A locked room is not opened by courage. It is opened by proximity, timing, and a cover story that sounds like labor. The men assigned to this step treated a guard's attention as something to redirect, not defeat. One man stepped forward with a work request that forced a guard to look at him and answer him. Another man used that moment to get close enough to the storage point to take what he could carry without slowing down. The firearms were not a path to victory. They were a way to buy seconds later, when seconds might decide whether a group broke through or died pressed against a barrier. The camp tested their discipline before the chosen day. Guards could count tools. Guards could punish an entire work detail to find one missing object. Close to the planned action, a check like that could destroy everything. On a day when a guard demanded that tools be returned and checked, the men in that detail moved fast to restore the pattern the guard expected. A tool that had been shifted for later use went back into place before the guard's count could turn into a search. The organizers treated that moment as a warning they could not ignore. They adjusted where tools would be seized. They kept sensitive steps away from routines that drew scrutiny. They did not get angry. They moved the plan like a piece of contraband, always away from the next hand that might expose it. Secrecy did not end danger. Secrecy moved danger inside the group. A man could break the plan without meaning to. He could ask the wrong question at the wrong time. He could hesitate when speed mattered more than sense. The organizers did not solve this with debate. They solved it with control. They shifted roles when a man's nerve failed. They moved the most fragile steps away from the weakest hands. They treated fear as another leak to seal. The plan also needed a day, and the day needed a window. The prisoners watched routine because routine was the only cover they had. They watched guard movement. They watched who carried keys and when. They watched when attention drifted. They watched when the camp looked slightly less tight, not because it was safer, but because guards believed it was safe enough. They did not wait for a perfect moment. A perfect moment did not exist. They waited for a usable moment. A usable moment was one in which several things could happen at once. If one group moved alone, guards could crush it and then lock down the camp. If multiple groups moved together, guards would have to choose what to stop first. Choice would create openings. That is why synchronization mattered more than heroism. The plan depended on a start that was shared. A fire starting in one place without movement elsewhere would turn into a warning flare. Movement without fire would turn into a clean suppression. The plan needed both at once, plus the grab for tools and whatever weapons could be taken. The organizers kept the signal simple because complexity dies under pressure. They could not use radios. They could not use whistles without drawing attention. They relied on what the camp already forced them to do, respond to routine cues and routine commands. They chose a cue that would not surprise guards, because surprise draws eyes. The cue would make men move in a direction the camp already expected, and then it would let them break from that line at the same instant. As the chosen day arrived, the plan stopped being an idea and became objects placed in real space. A tool set where a hand could reach it fast. Material that could catch and spread fire. Men positioned near routes they would use. Men positioned near points that could either open or block a path. None of this could look like a plan. It had to look like work until the second it became revolt. The man who watched locks took his position. He kept his eyes down and his body busy. He waited for the moment when a door would matter more than a beating. He did not expect a fair fight. He expected one motion that would change what was possible. If he failed, his group would have to force another route, and that would cost lives they did not have. The man near the tools put his hands on wood and metal like he had done every day. He kept his face empty because a face can betray a plan. He did not lift the tool early. He waited because lifting early would get him killed before the first step. He also watched other men. If someone broke discipline and grabbed too soon, he would have to decide whether to follow and risk exposure or hold and risk isolation. The group assigned to fire moved as if it was carrying ordinary materials. Later accounts suggest they planned to use fire to destroy and to signal. The exact first point of ignition is not fixed beyond dispute in the surviving record. The plan did not require the future to remember that detail. The plan required the smoke to rise. Outside the fences, the railway worker's photograph existed now as an object that could outlive the day. Inside the fences, the prisoners did not know their smoke would be captured on film. They acted anyway. They could not count on mercy. They could only count on minutes. By late morning, every man who had a role had stepped into it. They had weapons to reach for, even if the weapons were few. They had tools to grab. They had fire to start. They had one shared weakness they could not remove. If a guard noticed them 1 minute too soon, the camp could turn their plan into a trap before the first runner reached the fence. On the 2nd day of August in 1943, the signal did not arrive as a speech. It arrived as motion. Men who had carried loads under guard for months shifted their feet at the same time. Hands that had stayed open and visible closed around metal and wood. A fire that had waited in silence took air and took hold. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, about 1,000 Jewish prisoners forced to work at Treblinka rose in revolt that day. They seized what they could reach: picks, axes, and a small number of firearms taken from the camp armory. They set parts of the camp on fire. Those facts set the boundaries of what could happen next. Minutes were the limit, and every move had to fit inside them. The men assigned to tools moved first because tools were already part of work. A pick that lay in a familiar place could be lifted without a guard asking why. An axe could leave a rack with the same motion used for splitting wood. The difference was where the hands carried it next. They carried it toward doors, toward fences, toward any point that could be turned into a break. The men assigned to the armory moved as if they were still doing a job. They did not sprint across open ground. Sprinting draws a rifle. They walked fast, they kept their heads down, and they used the noise of the first fire to cover the fact that their formation was wrong. Survivor accounts and later research agree on the result without fixing every step. Some prisoners reached the place where firearms were stored and took a limited number. Those firearms were too few to arm a crowd, but they were enough to change the balance at a doorway, enough to make a guard hesitate, enough to buy a short passage across open ground that would otherwise be fatal. Fire spread in a way that did not wait for permission. Treblinka had wooden structures and stored materials that could burn hard once ignited. The men who lit the fires did not light them for drama. They lit them to overload the guard system. A guard who sees flames must decide whether to fight the fire, chase a runner, or protect his own escape route. Every forced decision is an opening for someone else. As smoke thickened, the plan stopped being separate tasks and became one surge. Men ran. Some ran with tools in their hands. Some ran with nothing in their hands because speed mattered more than any weapon. Some ran because they understood the plan. Some ran because they saw the fire and knew the camp had changed and the old rules were ending. The guards reacted fast. Treblinka was built to control prisoners and to prevent escape. The perimeter was guarded. Watch positions could see movement. The fences were meant to delay a rush long enough for gunfire to do the rest. When the revolt began, the guards did not need to guess the stakes. Their job was to stop the breakouts and then to punish the survivors. They opened fire. They shouted orders. They pushed men toward narrow points where a few weapons could do more damage than 100 men with tools could. The prisoners had planned for confusion, but confusion has teeth. Smoke blocks sight, but it also blocks coordination. A fire draws men toward the nearest open space, and open space is where a rifle works best. A crowd gives courage, but a crowd also jams at narrow points. Men reached a barrier and found that the opening they expected was not where they were standing. Other men reached a different point and found a way through that they had not planned. The revolt broke into smaller fights measured in steps and breaths, then split again when a new burst of gunfire changed the direction of the crowd. Some men used tools to cut, pry, or strike at whatever stood between them and the outside. Some men used the few firearms to push back guards long enough for others to move. No reliable record supports a claim that large numbers of German guards were killed in this revolt, and later, institutional work associated with the Treblinka Museum warns that reports about guard losses are contradictory, and that there may have been no German deaths at all. The prisoners did not need a pile of bodies to change the day. They needed a gap, and they used any gap they could force. Survivor recollections describe moments when men reached a fence and found that pushing alone did nothing. The fence held and gunfire cut the line. Then the pressure shifted as the fighting moved and attention snapped to a new flash of chaos. In those seconds, some men climbed, tore at wire with hands and with tools, and dropped on the far side running. Around the perimeter, the first wave of men got out into the space beyond the fences. That step did not make them free. It only changed the type of danger they faced. Inside the camp, danger came from structure and routine. Outside the camp, danger came from the search. The men who broke through scattered because scattering made it harder to stop everyone at once. A tight group is easy to track. A tight group runs into the same road and the same villagers. Scattering helped some men survive the first minutes, but it also took away mutual protection. Friends lost friends. Men who had stood shoulder to shoulder a moment earlier no longer had the same direction or the same speed. Some ran straight into the tree line because trees offer cover. Some ran along the edge of open ground until they could drop into a ditch. Some ran toward anything that looked like a route away from the camp. None of them had a safe map. None of them had food, money, or papers that could pass a check. They carried only what they could steal in a moment and what they could keep on their bodies. By the time the first men reached cover, the pursuit had already started. Guards and local forces could move along roads and paths. They could question people. They could search areas that the runners had to cross to get farther away. A man who escapes an enclosed camp still has to move through a countryside that has eyes and ears. In that region, help and betrayal both existed. A farmer might give a man a crust of bread and point him toward a forest. Another farmer might shut the door and then walk to a post to tell on him. A runner who reached the forest faced a second fight. He had to slow down without being caught. He had to breathe without making noise. He had to decide whether to move by day and risk being seen or move by night and risk stepping into a patrol. He had to decide whether to approach a village for water or avoid villages and accept thirst. These were choices with immediate consequences. Survivor accounts describe men crouching behind brush and measuring movement by the rhythm of footsteps. When the footsteps moved away, they shifted one body length and stopped again. Other accounts describe men finding shallow depressions near fields, lying flat, and waiting until light changed enough to move without drawing a clear outline. Some survivors later described hiding by lying still while searchers passed within earshot. Others describe moving in short bursts, freezing whenever a sound changed, then moving again. Accounts differ because people were in different places and had different luck. The common point is the same. After the revolt, survival depended less on courage than on discipline, and on a string of decisions made under exhaustion. There was another pressure that shaped those decisions. Many of the men had seen that German authorities worked to destroy evidence of mass murder. They understood that the camp itself might be dismantled. That knowledge cut two ways. It made them desperate because it meant time was short. It also made them stubborn because it meant testimony mattered. A man who lived long enough to speak could counter the lie that the place had never existed. The pursuit did not unfold as one clean sweep. It unfolded as many small traps. A patrol could hold a road and force runners to detour. Search dogs could pull a line of men toward a hiding place. A passerby could notice an unfamiliar face and report it. Runners who looked sick and underfed drew attention. Even runners who did everything right could be caught by chance. As hours passed, the revolt turned into a set of private stories. One man crawled into a stand of reeds and stayed there until night, then moved along a stream because water masked sound and broke tracks. Another cut across a field and reached a barn, then found it empty and too visible, so he left before dawn. Another found a sympathetic person who gave him clothing, then learned that clothing alone could not create a new identity when his body and his fear still marked him as a man running for his life. These were not legends. They were attempts to survive one more hour. In the days after the revolt, people tried to count what had happened, and the counting depended on where a line was drawn. Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center, has material stating that about 750 prisoners attempted to escape, and that most were captured. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum states that about 200 escaped from the camp and that roughly half of those were later captured and killed. These statements can stand together because they describe different steps in the same collapse, from participation to attempted flight, to leaving the camp perimeter, to remaining alive after the pursuit. For the men on the ground, the filter felt like a tightening net. Each mile away from the camp did not reduce danger in a straight line. Sometimes distance helped, Sometimes distance forced them toward a road or a village where danger increased. A man who hid too close could be found by an immediate sweep. A man who pushed too far could stumble into a checkpoint. The best path shifted with patrols, with weather, and with who was watching. At some point in the first day, many runners faced the same unavoidable decision. They had to choose between moving with someone slower or leaving him behind. Outside the camp, staying together could save a life, but it could also kill two men instead of one. Some stayed together and paid for it when they could not outrun the search. Some split and paid for it in a different way, carrying the knowledge of what they did while still running. Night did not end the pursuit. Night only changed its rhythm. Darkness helped runners cross open ground, but it also made them stumble. Darkness hid them from distant eyes, but it also hid obstacles. A runner who fell and injured himself could not call for help. A runner who lost direction could circle back toward the camp. A runner who approached a house at night could be met with fear and a raised weapon. In a countryside under occupation, a stranger at night could trigger a report instead of help. By the next day, exhaustion became a weapon in the hands of the searchers. A guard on a patrol could rest and return to duty. A runner could not. Hunger and thirst made judgment worse. A man might take a risk he would have refused 12 hours earlier. He might step onto a road because he could not bear another hour in the brush. He might ask for water from the wrong person because he could no longer swallow. Some men were caught in these moments. They were caught not because they lacked will, but because a system built for capture finally met bodies that could not keep moving. Once caught, there was little room for bargaining. The pursuit was not an arrest process aimed at a trial. It was a sweep aimed at removal. Still, some men did get away, and their survival depended on a chain of concrete decisions. They avoided roads when they could. They used cover when they could. They moved when patrols moved away. They accepted help when it appeared and when it did not increase exposure. They learned to leave before a conversation turned into suspicion. None of this was guaranteed. It was a sequence of trade-offs made under pressure. The revolt inside Treblinka had been designed around minutes. The escape outside Treblinka was designed around days and weeks, even if many did not have that long. The men who survived long enough to be counted as escaped did not arrive at safety with a clean ending. They arrived with a new problem. They had no protection. They had no official status. They carried a story that many people did not want to hear or were afraid to repeat. The smoke that rose on the second day of August had already done one job. It had crossed the fence line and entered the world beyond the camp. The railway worker's photograph, taken from a distance, had fixed the smoke as a public fact. But a photograph of smoke could not explain why the smoke mattered. The men who lived had to carry the second part of the signal. They had to live long enough to speak, and they had to keep speaking long enough for their words to survive the same erasure that would destroy buildings, documents, and traces. By the time the pursuit thinned, the revolt had produced its harsh arithmetic. Many had risen. Many had tried to run. Fewer had escaped the immediate sweep. Fewer still remained alive after capture and killing reduced the number again. The men who stayed out did not carry a victory. They carried a burden that could not be dropped without ending their own lives. Somewhere beyond the trees, the survivors kept moving because stopping still meant death. They also kept moving because they understood what could happen to the camp itself. If the camp could burn, it could also be taken apart. If it could be taken apart, the absence could be used as a lie. The men who had escaped were now carrying the kind of proof that could follow a destroyed place. They carried what they had seen, and they carried the fact that the smoke had risen on a day that could be dated and shown. After the revolt, the men who had broken out did not gain a safe rear area. They gained distance, and distance forced new choices. Patrols moved on the roads and cut across fields. People in nearby villages heard gunfire and saw smoke, then heard new orders and warnings. The search tightened around every path that led away from Treblinka. One escapee reached water and drank too fast, then vomited and had to crawl away from the bank. That delay put him behind the others. He waited for night, then moved again, slower. Another man tried to keep a small group together. He watched their pace drop and watched them start to argue about direction. He split the group before the argument grew loud enough to draw attention. The split saved one man, and it cost another. The escape continued as a chain of trade-offs made under exhaustion. Inside the perimeter, guards recovered order. Fires were put out where they could be put out. Damaged areas were blocked. Tools were counted again. The revolt did not break the structure that made Treblinka lethal. It broke the idea that the forced laborers would remain silent. Later, institutional timelines describe that German authorities worked to destroy evidence of the killings and to remove traces of the camp. After the revolt, that pressure increased. Work crews were driven to tear down what existed. Wood and metal were removed. Anything that could point to the purpose of the place was reduced, moved, or burned. The goal was not only to close the site, the goal was to make the site deny itself. Structures were leveled and debris was cleared. The ground was turned over. The terrain began to look like land that had always been ordinary. Later accounts describe the area being disguised as a farm. The disguise did not need to fool an expert. It needed to give a passerby a reason to keep walking. The men who had escaped understood that this was the final stage. They had watched the machine run. Now they watched the machine erase its own footprint. That changed the value of every scrap of proof that could survive outside the wire. The railway worker's photograph mattered more in that new phase. It was external. It could be linked to the date by later records and comparison. It showed smoke from the direction of Treblinka on a specific day. It could not prove every detail, but it could block the simplest lie. It could block the claim that nothing burned and therefore nothing happened. The survivors carried a different kind of proof. They carried memory, and memory had to survive fear. A man who escaped did not step into a world eager to protect him. He stepped into occupied territory that still punished anyone who helped a Jew. He stepped into a landscape where papers mattered, and his body carried the marks of captivity. He had to stay alive first. He also had to decide how much of his story to risk sharing while he was still running. Some survivors stayed silent at first because silence reduced exposure. Silence also protected the people who gave them food or shelter. A man who told his full story could frighten a helper into turning him away. A man who told his story to the wrong person could be betrayed in an hour. So many survivors treated their words like contraband. They used them only when the risk made sense. When the war ended, that calculation changed, but it did not disappear. A survivor had to find work and a bed, and a way to move through towns where people wanted to forget. He also had to decide whether to speak about a place that had been turned into empty ground. He could not point to buildings. He could not point to documents that had been burned. He could only point to what he had seen and to what could still be checked. That is why testimony became an action. A survivor had to choose a day to sit down with another person and describe the camp. He had to describe routes and routines. He had to describe how the revolt was prepared under guard and launched in minutes. He had to describe the flight and the search and the thinning numbers. He had to do this while knowing that his words would be questioned. Institutions later collected and evaluated these accounts. The United States Holocaust Memorial Museum assembled timelines and estimates. Yad Vashem, the World Holocaust Remembrance Center, did the same. Their numbers and descriptions did not match in every line because no single record survived that could settle every count. Their work still set boundaries that denial could not cross. Those boundaries mattered most when people demanded a clean story of victory. Some listeners wanted a tale of German guards killed in large numbers because that made the revolt feel like a battle won. Researchers checked the record and found no solid footing for that claim. The Treblinka Museum has noted that guard losses cannot be established with reliable data, that reports contradict each other, and that the most likely situation is that no German guards were killed. A survivor who cared about proof would not trade truth for comfort. In an interview, a survivor might be pressed on the same point. Did you see a guard fall? Did you fire a gun? Did you kill anyone? The pressure behind the questions is simple. People want numbers. The survivor who stayed within evidence would answer with what he knew and refuse what he could not lock down. That refusal kept the revolt from being turned into a legend that could be dismissed as exaggeration. The revolt's military result was never going to be decisive. The guards had the perimeter, the weapons and the authority. The prisoners had minutes and tools and a few stolen guns. The revolt could not topple the system. It could force a breach. It could send smoke into the sky. It could move some men beyond the fences. It could create witnesses that the camp was designed to eliminate. That outcome shows up in the numbers that institutions report. Many participated. Many attempted to run. About 200, according to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, escaped from the camp, and about half of those were later captured and killed. Another institution reports that about 750 attempted to escape and that most were captured. Those statements can stand together because they describe different steps in the same collapse, from revolt to attempted flight, to leaving the camp perimeter, to remaining alive after the pursuit. The men who survived did not carry a banner from Treblinka. They carried what they could carry, their bodies, their scars, and their knowledge. Each survivor who spoke later performed the same act again. He broke through another barrier, not wire this time, but denial and fatigue. The photograph of smoke stayed as a hard object in that effort. It could be held in a hand. It could be stored and copied. It could be shown to someone who did not trust memory. It could be placed beside a timeline and a map and a testimony. It could put a marker in the world outside the camp. The site itself did not survive to argue with them. The dismantling and disguise turned it into a place that could be passed without knowing. That was the plan. The plan failed in one key way. The revolt forced Treblinka into the outside world on a date that could be traced. It forced smoke into the sky and sent men out into the countryside. It forced the need for records into the years that followed, even when people wanted to turn away. A survivor who decided to testify had to pick the form of his proof. He could give names if he was sure of them. He could describe roles instead of names when names were uncertain. He could describe the two goals that drove the revolt, an opening for escape and a signal that could outlive the runners. He could anchor his account to dates and to actions, not to speeches. He could also choose one concrete item to protect. Some survivors protected a photograph, a document, or a statement made as soon as they were able. Others protected a set of details that could be checked later, where the rail line ran, where the camp sat, what the smoke showed from outside, and what a work detail could reach inside. Protecting proof is a chain of decisions about what to carry, what to hide, and when to hand it to someone who can preserve it. In the end, the revolt at Treblinka did not change the course of the war. It denied the camp a clean disappearance. It created a breach in a system designed to leave no witnesses. It left a photograph in the open air. It left survivors who could speak and who could keep their speech tied to evidence. Years later, a survivor sat down with a researcher and completed a statement. He did not decorate it, he finished it. He placed his name under it, then put the paper into another person's hands. That handoff turned private survival into public record. It turned the revolt into something the dismantling could not erase.